For some reason, I really enjoy collecting trash. Maybe it's the idea that you could try to restore it to its former glory, or that you could even take it apart and turn it into something completely new. But as you can see here, I've managed to build up quite the pile. And all of this has been in an attempt to recreate an idea that I had about 6 years ago. I want to build a go-kart completely from trash. That means no buying tools or hardware or fasteners, none of that. Only using the garbage that I've collected here over the years and any new stuff that I can find from the trash. The only exception to that rule is a small engine that I managed to pick up, which works quite well. Now, I'm not nearly smart enough to build my own engine out of trash, and trying to find one that nice for free would be basically impossible. So it's the single caveat with this build. Let me explain all the stuff that I have, and we'll see if any of it is actually useful for building a go-kart. I've got one dismantled rowing machine, one chopped up kid's bike, one wagon filled with random wheels, one lawnmower worth of parts, assorted rusty metal shelving, several crates of pallet chunks, 4 containers with assorted metal pipes, chains, caster wheels, brackets, and hinges, 4 tins with recycled screws, bolts, and washers, and other bits collected from junked power washers, garages, windows, and so on. Now, from what you see here, I ideally would like to build the go-kart as bare bones as possible. 1, to save on weight because this engine is not insanely strong, and 2, because I'm pretty limited by what I have here. I only have so many bolts and screws and everything, and if I run out of those, then I'm forced to go find new materials. So bare bones to keep weight down and to limit what I'm actually using. From here, I actually have to get into the nitty-gritty of things and figure out what's going to go where, what wheels I'm going to use, what the body's going to be made out of, and start piecing this thing together. So now to tear down this very lovely mosaic I just built and see what's actually going to work for the go-kart. So if you can see this on the ground here, this is going to be the main body of the go-kart. These white metal shelves and these green posts are going to support it, and I will be sitting somewhere on there. This is actually going to be the front axle, which is going to go on the underside of these shelves like this. I have my front wheels here, which are from a lawnmower, and I have my back wheels over here, which are from a bike. So my very first step is going to be assembling the main body, making sure that's rigid enough to actually support my weight, which it should be, and then after that, I will try to get the front wheels assembled to the steering system. So we'll see how that goes.
I didn't have full overlap with these green metal bars, but I thought the structure of the shelves would be strong enough.
Now that the main frame is actually assembled, I can start to get a better idea of how things are actually going to fit together. And it is going to be a little tight. As you can see, the engine is very, very close behind me, and this chair has barely enough room to fit onto here. But the next critical part that I start working on is our steering system and our wheels. So this is going to be my very lovely front steering. So it's time to break out the angle grinder and start cutting things to make them actually useful for this project. So why don't we get to it? Okay, at this point, I believe I've cut out just about all the parts that I need for the front steering system. I'm still gonna have to do a few adjustments and cut a few holes and things, but generally I should have all of the parts to start assembling. So now to do that.
Okay, hold on, stop for a minute here. This is objectively a bad design. I was using wood and screws because I didn't want to use metal and bolts because I have less metal and bolts. But this is adding a lot more points of failure into the design. Ultimately, I ended up giving up on this design and went with something a lot better.
Let's take a minute here to look and see what's changed and see how this is going to function a lot better than the not amazing idea I had for the steering at first. So first of all, as you can see, the connection point here is entirely different than what I was intending. I was going to do the double wood and then kind of sandwich these axles in between. The clearance on that was just not feasible. It would have not worked. Turning this requires a lot of good radius to turn. And if we were to do that, it would not turn nicely. You would just have all sorts of clearance issues. So what I ended up doing was going with just a straight piece here with these round metal pipes that are from the rowing machine going directly through it, which is technically not connected at all. This is just a sleeve that goes inside of there. But the weight of the cart pushing down should keep this from ever coming out of its sleeve. The bolts, I still need to adjust the exact height because this is a little bit shorter than this. But these are locked in place on the top to prevent them from slipping through and have ball bearings on the bottom to ease in turning. The next step to make this actually functional is to do 2 tie rods going from both of these to a middle point here, which goes to the steering column and allows both of these to rotate. In terms of actual wheel assembly, this is done. Additionally, my intentions for the back steering system have changed. I was originally going to use both of these 2 wheels on the back here and have this one have power supplied to it. We have another problem in that regard. This wheel and this gear is fixed, which means this axle turns the same way this wheel turns. And unfortunately, that makes these wheels not very useful for this project. However, there is a solution, and the solution being a new wheel. This may look good, or at least semi-good from the outside, but if I start spinning it, you will probably see the issue that it has. This thing is not straight at all. It was the victim of an unlucky curb jump, and it was gifted to me by a friend. And maybe I'll be able to get better use out of it than he would, because as of now, this is not really bike worthy. However, for a go-kart made out of trash, it is perfectly acceptable. So the goal here is mostly going to be to clamp on either side of the wheel, have a chain going to this back gear, and that'll have it spin. So the plan as of now is to extend this out a little bit here, pipes. This is going to connect like this roughly, and we're going 3 wheels. If 3 wheels proves to be too unstable, we're upgrading to 5 wheels. And we'll have the one back with power, and we'll have these 2 that were not being used for power on the sides just to add support. So now I have to chop up some pipes and figure out how that back part is actually going to connect and how that is going to factor into the engine.
I cut the metal pipe in half, drilled a couple of holes, and since I already had the angle grinder out, I did some work on the front steering.
I am extremely excited right now because I officially have working steering. Now, I still need to tighten in all the bolts and such to make sure it's perfect, but it's functional, and I am so happy about that. So this probably looks completely different from what I was initially explaining, and that's because it is completely different. I had to rework a good chunk of this entire part to make everything actually function the way I thought it was going to. So let's start with the tie rods. I actually had to cut about 8 inches off of these. They were about here, out on each other. And that just made turning, the leverage was just not working. It was too much work needed to put in the first place. Initially, I said I was going to use wood and this piece of metal pipe going in through the bottom part of this steering rod. And that seemed like a good idea at first, but then I realized I need to bolt this piece of metal to this piece of metal. And with a bolt going through this, it's going to intersect with the pipe. That's not going to work. So I had to come up with a completely new idea. And the idea came to me when I found this piece of metal, and I thought, well, maybe we could only use a little bit. And that's what I ended up doing. It only goes in a tiny bit into here with this piece of metal. It's got a bracket on it right here, which keeps this from sliding down too low. And that connects to these long bolts, which I am so lucky to have after I helped somebody tear down an old swing set. And considering they didn't need any of it anymore, they said that I could take anything that was useful out of the trash that we made. And I managed to get all of this nice hardware, and already these are coming in handy for me to make this beautiful little support system here. So with that, this should be a completely functional steering system. And as you can see here, when I turn the steering wheel to the right here, the wheels turn to the right, and when I turn it to the left, they turn to the left. It obviously needs to be tightened up a little bit, but it's functional. Everything is working exactly the way I intended it to. And when I'm going straight, the wheels are basically straight. They're not perfect, but it is mighty close to perfect. And that, for something that's made completely out of garbage, is about as good as you're gonna get. We now have a fully freestanding go-kart. This back wheel is fully attached on. It's not the best possible way I could have done it, but it's certainly gonna be good enough for what we need. Unfortunately though, it's still a bit more rickety and has a bit more give than I would really like it to. So I am going to have to go with the 5-wheel design. However, I did figure out a method to make it very, very easy. And now simply, we're using another part of a lawnmower and the bike wheels that I originally didn't think I would be able to use. So we're gonna put them right where there's the most sag, which is right about here, which very conveniently happens to line up almost exactly with the middle point of these wheels. So because of that, I'm going to be able to mount one wheel on either side after cutting this piece in half. This is gonna get basically laid down like that and go underneath the seat. So that should provide all the support I really need for this cart. And at that point, it's just mounting the engine, getting the seat attached, figuring out the gas pedal and brakes, and then the thing is finished. I'm starting to get really excited to give this thing a real test. So let's chop up some metal and get some more wheels attached to this thing. I've now fully attached the extra wheels to provide some more support for the back individual wheel. However, I still think the design is a little bit too flimsy, so what I'm going to be doing is adding some wood to support this back section here and this middle section in here. So let's beef up the structure a little bit more here, and then we can start seeing if it's roadworthy enough to drive. Now we have a little bit more support on the go-kart. And you might be thinking, well, why did I put 2 beams here and not 1 here, or 1 here and 1 here? Well, the answer is because the engine is actually going to go right there. Hopefully this will provide enough structural support that I need to make this a little bit more sturdy than it was before, in addition to the 2 additional wheels. We're still getting a little bit of bend in the body, but not as much, especially considering I have these additional wheels for support and the additional structure to the body. Let's grab our engine here and see where it might actually go. So from what I can tell, it's going to be situated pretty far to the rear, right about there. So it's going to be obviously bolted into place, but we need to connect the clutch here to the back gears of our bike here. At this point, the structure of the cart is about 100% finished. I've done as much as I can to make this thing as drivable as possible with the current materials and tools that I have. So looking at a quick rundown of the entire cart, we have the front steering system, the brake system, we have the chassis, the supporting wheels, and we have the back wheel. All in all, a ton of different parts have gone into this. At this point, the only things that really need to be added are just various little flares to make the build more interesting and tightening down a couple cables and bolts. But otherwise, I think today's the day to test. Let's get those engines started. Unfortunately, go-kart test number 1 was not quite successful. And there's one main reason for that. It's simply because the chain that I had going from the engine to the back wheel would not stay on. So I have 2 options. Either I can try and reinforce the back setup with the chain to make it a little bit more sturdy, or I can change the drivetrain system. The way that makes the most sense to me is to change how the drivetrain works, and to go from the chain drive that I'm currently using to a friction drive setup. Now, the way the friction drive will work is I will have the back wheel directly rubbing against the clutch on the engine. And this will mean I don't need any extra gears or chains or any sort of connective material. It will simply be friction between the engine and the back wheel that will be driving the cart. Now, the first step in doing this drivetrain changeup is actually going to be removing the engine. And that might sound crazy at first until you think about the directionality of the clutch. So when the go-kart is running now, the clutch is spinning this direction. And when connected to the chain, that all works. But if this is being friction driven, this turning this way is going to make the wheel turn this way, which would have the cart be driving in reverse, which is not exactly what we want. So the engine has to be completely changed around to the opposite direction to make friction drive work. Actually putting the engine where it needs to go, there's a pretty small amount of clearance. Now, it's not all that much worse than the chain was, but it's still not a ton. Now, unfortunately, I cannot make the wheel any straighter, and I can't really move this any further away without moving the clutch too far away. And because of that, the clutch is not going to be centered directly on the middle of the wheel. It's kind of going to be centered onto the left side of it, which we will be able to make work, but it's just not perfect. So one good thing about this design is that the wheel tends to bow a little bit to the right. So having the engine placed all the way on the left, that could counteract that just a little bit and hopefully make the ride a touch more smooth. Now let's look for some wood and see if we can get this all put together. Now that the supporting area is actually assembled, it's time to do our last little bit here to make sure everything is all put together and functional. And what that is fully placing the engine in. So as I mentioned, it's going to be a very tight squeeze here, and we want to have things as close as they can possibly be to each other. And the way we're going to have to do that is to fully deflate the back tire, install the engine where I want it, and then re-inflate the back tire when I'm ready to test. That way, the pressure of reinflating this will lock the engine and wheel together. Now the tire is very nice and deflated, meaning we can fully align our engine in a way that will be much, much closer than it was before. That looks good, that looks good. It's a lot tighter than it was, so hopefully all is good with this configuration. So what we're gonna do is mark our holes, start drilling out some spots for this engine to go. The engine is now as locked in as it is going to be. It is perfectly in place, although it might not look like it right now. Simply because when more pressure gets added to the cart, this flexes upwards a little bit. This is going to be fully inflated, and this is not going anywhere once that happens, so this should become a much, much tighter fit. So let's plug the last couple cables into the engine, take off the back wheel, and get ready to do some testing. I'm excited and nervous, and I hope this test goes a little bit better than the last one. You know the drill. Yep, back to the drawing board.
Even though I was really frustrated with this test, I knew a few small changes could make the difference here. So after a couple quick fixes, I gave it one more attempt.
Gas pedal locked. Alright.
Because there was so much friction between the back tire and the engine, I needed a little bit of help to get the go-kart moving. And after acquiring this mechanical advantage, I was ready to push my go-kart to the limit.
It worked. I am so happy that everything worked. To build a go-kart out of nothing but trash, this was a hard project. I loved every minute of it. It was so fun to do this entire thing. I really did enjoy having to source all of the materials and create stuff out of nothing, and at the end it all worked. Which is, I can't really ask for anything better than that. Now this process was intense. It was so many hours of just finding parts and seeing what will work and taking things apart and brainstorming. And obviously I couldn't include all of that in this video. So if you want some in-depth behind the scenes and just general overviews of things that happened and where my head was at while I was working on this project, consider checking out my Patreon, link down below. Now, it's not perfect. It's had its setbacks both in building and trying to get it to run, but at the end of the day, it did run, it did work, and I did do it. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.